Okay, picture this. You're in charge of a massive billion-dollar construction project for a global company. You have to decide where to build it. How in the world do you compare the cost of building in, say, Texas versus Thailand or Germany versus Mexico? I mean, everything from labor rates to the price of steel is completely different. Well, let's dive into how the pros solve this exact billion-dollar puzzle.
So here's our game plan. We're going to start with the big question itself. Then we'll define the key tool that professionals use to answer it. After that, we'll get into the method, break down the costs with a real-world example, see how it all adds up, and finally, we'll talk about why this number is, well, never really set in stone. All right, let's kick things off with Section 1, the billion-dollar question.
This is a classic challenge. I mean, this is the kind of stuff that keeps executives up at night, because getting it wrong can cost a company hundreds of millions of dollars. So to make this real, let's use an example from our source material. A company wants to build a new chemical plant. They know exactly what it'll cost on the U.S. Gulf Coast. But what about building that very same plant down in Tampico, Mexico? And right away, you see the problem. We've got a solid number for the US, but the cost in Mexico is just this giant question mark. And you can't just punch the numbers into a currency converter and call it a day. Nope. The price of labor, materials, equipment, taxes, even how productive the workers are, it's all completely different. So how do you solve this? Well, they use a special tool. It's called a location factor. And this little number is the key to making a true apples-to-apples comparison between any two places on the planet. Okay, so let's look at the official definition. It sounds a little corporate, right? But basically, a location factor is just a multiplier. You take the cost of a project in a place you know, you multiply by this factor, and boom, you get the estimated cost for the new location. It's designed to be an instantaneous snapshot in time. Now, what's really crucial to understand is what this factor actually covers. It's got all the construction stuff baked in: labor, materials, taxes, design, the whole shebang. But, and this is important, it specifically leaves out things like the cost of buying the land itself, or if you decide to suddenly change the project's design. It's purely focused on the cost of building a very specific, defined project. So, how do they come up with this powerful number? Well, it's definitely not a guess. It's a really rigorous process called the factoring method. It really just boils down to these three steps. First, you start with a super detailed cost estimate for a project in a place you know inside and out, like the US Gulf Coast. That's your base estimate. Next, you create a parallel estimate by going through every single line item and adjusting it for the new location's costs. And finally, you just divide the new estimate by the old one. That ratio, that is your location factor. And this is where the power of this method really shines. Because it's all about ratios, it's about relative differences, you don't need a brand new estimate every time. The source material even points out that you could use a 20-year-old base estimate and it would still work, because you're just measuring how costs in Tampico have changed relative to the Gulf Coast. Pretty cool, right? All right, let's get into the weeds. It's time to see how this works in the real world with our Tampico, Mexico example. This is where it gets really interesting. Just to figure out the factor for labor, just labor, you have to break it down into all these little pieces. You're comparing the all-in wage rates, you're weighting different jobs, because, pipe fitters are a way bigger part of the cost than painters. And then you get to the productivity factor. The source itself says this is the most subjective part of the whole thing. In this case, they estimate that a task taking 1 hour on the Gulf Coast will take 1.75 hours in Tampico, just because of differences in tools, skills, and work habits. So after you mix in the wages, the productivity, all of it, the analysis boils down to this really simple comparison. The effective all-in cost of labor for this project is almost $31 an hour on the Gulf Coast versus less than $8 an hour in Tampico. That's a huge difference. And that gives us our first big number. The labor factor is 0.25. So in plain English, for this specific project, labor in Tampico is calculated to be a whopping 75% cheaper than its US counterpart. And here's the kicker. That incredibly detailed process we just walked through for labor? Yeah, that gets repeated for everything. For steel pipes, for pumps, for electrical wiring, for concrete, you name it. They create dozens and dozens of these individual factors with the exact same level of detail. Okay, so now we have all these individual factors for every little thing: labor, materials, equipment. It's time to roll them all up to get that one final number, the overall location factor for the entire project.
This chart shows why you can't just take the average. Look, labor is a big piece of the pie at 23%, but the equipment is even bigger at 34%. Each of these slices gets its own carefully calculated factor, and the size of the slice determines how much it influences the final number, right? A huge discount on a tiny slice doesn't move the needle nearly as much as a small discount on a big one.
So you take your original base estimate, you go line by line, and you multiply each cost by its unique new factor. The labor cost gets multiplied by 0.25, the steel cost gets multiplied by its factor, and so on and so on. This creates that parallel estimate, and the ratio between the two, that gives you your final location factor. But we're not quite done, because this powerful number you've worked so hard to calculate, well, it has a very short shelf life. You have to think of it as a living, breathing thing. And this brings us to probably the single most important warning in this whole process. The source document is crystal clear about this. A location factor is totally meaningless unless you know the exact exchange rate and the exact date it was calculated. So what does that mean in the real world? It means the work is never really done. To be useful, these factors have to be updated constantly. We're talking monthly sometimes, just to account for tiny changes in inflation and currency rates. A factor from 6 months ago could already be dangerously wrong. So there you have it. It's this incredibly detailed, disciplined, and continuous process that turns a massive, confusing global problem into a single, actionable number. It's the hidden engine driving some of the biggest business decisions on the planet, which really just leaves us with one final question. Now that you know how the pros do it, if you were in charge, where would you build?